It's my great honor and pleasure to have the role as the moderator, although the program didn't announce this. For those of us who didn't have the chance to meet me yet, I'm Uli Brückner. I'm the board of directors here, and in a way I'm also affiliated with this institution because they have an expert service called Team Europe, and I often have the opportunity to sit on this particular chair here to explain Europe. But today this is not my role, but it's, as I said, a great honor when Mark asked me to moderate this panel discussion on an interesting topic like European identity. I immediately accepted because I thought this is a perfect opportunity not only to reflect on a key topic of what our perspective here on cultural diplomacy is about and what it means in this particular part of the world, but also to hopefully connect the one or the other line of argumentation that was immediately interrupted due to our program. And it's not about bits and pieces and reflecting this thing and then jumping on something completely different, but to have it as some sort of an ongoing discussion about what's going on here. I must say I'm very impressed by your performance after so many days of intense work during the day and also applied cultural studies in the evening. I'm quite impressed not only by your physical presence and how fresh you look, but also by the challenge of the questions. And so since this is not about performing here live on stage and you just consume or listen to what distinguished speakers have to say, we will also divide, as usual, the session between what we have to say here on the panel, as well as leave enough time for your questions here. And so the reason why I felt so honored was that it usually doesn't happen that I sit here surrounded by distinguished guests that Mark has already introduced. We have not only two presidents of state from Romania and from Latvia, but also from a regional level, the First Minister of Scotland as a previous position of Jack McConnell and Willem as some sort of a former host because he worked in this building for several years to help us Germans to understand what this European economic integration thing is about, which is another form of applied European studies. And on the other hand, this is something like a family reunion because all of us have worked for many years with the ICD and supported in various ways, as you hopefully do in the future. So this is not just another formal event that often happens here, but as I said, the family reunion of those who are dedicated to the work of ICD. So without further ado, I think we can just start what we usually do in formats of that kind by just tackle the topic and ask ourselves, what is this thing, European identity? And sometimes it's discussed in a way in which the European Union has been asked, what do you actually do to strengthen identity, because it's somehow the glue that holds everything together. But as we all know, it doesn't come top down in the way that politicians invent an identity and we just have to buy it or accept it, but it's a very more complex and diverse idea, which also has a lot to do with our self-perception of who we are and what we want to be. So as a first test or a survey, how many Europeans are in this room? Okay, quite many. And from those who come from the continent Europe, how many would say yes to the question of, I have a European identity? Oh, still quite a lot. And how many of those who come from Europe would not subscribe to this question? Okay, so there are also some people who don't automatically have a European identity. And that is the first thing, that we have an empirical survey in a way. And on the other hand, we usually tackle in the first round the question of, what is this thing, European identity, and how can we actually define it? And I thought it could be a good idea to ask this to someone who has worked outside of the Netherlands, being by profession an economist, having joined the European Commission several years ago, and as most of us also worked in academia, because he taught in Pittsburgh, if I'm not mistaken, which is an interesting experience to tell people who are not directly involved in what we do here, to explain what is going on in this European part, and also not necessarily from a European macroeconomic perspective, but reflecting on what is the mindset of someone who has constantly to do with European integration and is working on highly technical aspects or highly abstract aspects like the functioning of a single market or a monetary union, which is currently also a very hot debate, and maybe we one day set up a panel discussion on this as well. But also, what are the basics? What are you actually working on, and what is like your normative point of view on what this European integration project is about? Willem.
Thank you, Uli, for the very kind invitation. Yes, to indeed explain briefly my background, I'm an economist. I've been working on European integration for about 15 years now, basically dealing with two themes: globalization, what it is, what it means for policy making, and enlargement. I worked on Iceland, on Slovenia and Cyprus, at the time candidate countries, and now I've returned to Brussels to work on the hopeful entry of Iceland into the EU, which is another very fascinating topic. And in the course of my work as an economist, I've come to learn actually that the only way you can actually understand European integration is you take into account European history and European politics, because otherwise a lot of it doesn't seem to be making sense. Modern European integration is above all an economic project, but it's embedded, very deeply embedded in economic and social and political history of Europe. And I just wanted to make a few points also to help the discussion maybe. I think European culture itself actually is a very interesting and conflicting mix of four different roots. I saw you already had another day on this as well. I just want to mention it briefly, namely Greek, Roman, Christian, and Germanic. And one of the interesting things is that some of these ideas of these four roots constantly battle with each other, are incompatible, yet exist at the same time simultaneously. And it's this constant stress that makes for a lot of European integration. Basically, the myth of unity, the dream of European unity, is as old as the Roman Empire. This is one of the legacies of the Roman Empire, the myth of unity, because Europe never was unified. Not to the extent that a lot of people envisage it anyway. That was taken over by the idea of a Christian commonwealth. Christianity also functioned as a very strong uniting force within Europe, at least in theory. And then, for instance, to give an example of these conflicting notions that are very European, ideas of unity and solidarity and equality and the rule of law and social democracy and the whole idea of a nation state are just as European as is fascism or anti-Semitism or communism. Those ideas also have very deep European roots, and yet they exist at the same time simultaneously. There's also another very typical European thing that is very deeply embedded also, I think, in the European psyche, namely an obsession with rules. Rules should be applied to everybody. This is from Enlightenment and Christianity. We are all equal before the eyes of God. They should be applied for everybody, to everybody, and everybody is equal. This insistence and people getting very upset when you do not follow their rules runs like a red thread through European history, and still, for instance, today, member states are extremely sensitive to being treated equal also by the Commission, extremely sensitive to that. And that comes from a very long, deep history in Europe, that indeed rules should be applied to everybody in an equal way. At the same time, there's this pressure that everybody wants to make their own rules, that my rules are better than your rules, and you have to follow mine rather than your rules. And that tension, again, translates in this resistance, for instance, that one rule should apply from Brussels to everybody. It wasn't so long ago that we had the same debate almost from one rule coming from Rome should apply for everybody, and people resisting that, and then we were in the Reformation. So there's a lot of this thing going on, this constant pulling apart, at the same time this dream of unity. And there's a tension there that now translates in modern forms of European integration, and I already referred to that modern European integration is above all economic integration, the internal market. It is not, empathically not, cultural integration, or religious integration. This is the old method of European integration. I already also referred to that this was a top-down approach, militarily imposed through power. Now this is economics, and a lot of political cooperation follows from that, simply because of the sheer fact that a lot of sovereignty that countries have, they only have still in a legal sense, but in a factual sense, that sovereignty was lost a long time ago. And the argument also, for instance, one strong argument to join the European Union is in fact, it allows you to reach objectives that you no longer can reach on your own, even your own fully legitimate legal sovereign objectives. It forces you to cooperate because basically everything that crosses borders provides incentives to cooperate. And that also brings me to globalization very briefly. From an economic perspective, I think globalization is quite easy to explain. It's basically the crossing of borders of the production process. The production process spreads across borders. This brings a lot of economic advantages. This is also one of the key things of thinking in European integration. This, like I said, provides incentives to cooperate. The Greek crisis is a prime example, but almost any other crisis are examples of European crisis, global crisis, are examples of how countries discover that the only way they can get anything done is through cooperation, and the European Union offers a very deep form of this cooperation. At the same time, there are fears about losing your cultural identity, about being turned into a Euro sausage when you turn member into the European Union. This, again, are very European fears, and again, also it is no coincidence that European integration is indeed economic integration, not religious integration, not cultural integration. To some extent political integration, but that only follows the precepts of economics, actually. So these are just a few points. A final point maybe that in a way European integration is also a reaction to globalization, again because of this idea that the only way a country can get anything done at the European level or the global level is by becoming a part of what I always describe as an elephant. Joining the EU is joining the elephant. You now have a voice in what the elephant does. It's a big beast, it's going to do whatever it's going to do, and it now allows, and now you are becoming part of that. And also not only internally within the elephant, but also talking to other elephants. Small countries like the Netherlands or Luxembourg, speaking with Russia or China or the US, you speak as part of an elephant with another elephant, which is a very different kind of debate that's going to take place as small Luxembourg with large China, for instance. So these are just some points of thought. I'll stop here, but some points of thought on European integration and identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willem. President Constantinescu, we learned that joining the European Union is not just joining a club and then you have a membership like a member in NATO and then you can get in and get out and you stay the same country. But a candidate country has to go through a long and serious negotiation process with people like Willem on the other side of the table. And they carefully analyze every single piece of law, whether it's fully implemented into something else. So in practice, that means 100,000 pages of legislation has not only to be translated, but also to be accepted and used and has to become part of the culture of a country. And these are rules and norms and values transformed into this legal body of the European Union, which are other countries' rules and norms and obligations and so on. So on the one hand, it's a voluntary decision to decide we want to become part of something bigger. And on the other hand, you have to accept somebody else's order. So what does that mean for a country that wasn't a founding member as Germany or the Netherlands? And what does that mean for European identity in the perspective of Romania?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The recent global economic crisis reveals, besides the economical and social difficulties, even a more profound fact: the fracture between the present globalized political and economical system and the cultural model that defined its very beginnings. The 21st century needs a new cultural model able to face not only the globalized world economical and social shocks, but also able to create a hopeful vision towards a future characterized by chaotic developments and incertitude. There is now a historical change to come up with such a project. For the beginning, it is necessary to subject to a critical review the two political projects that have represented the engine of the democratic and market economy progress, the United States and the European Union. Both structures, even those sharing common values and principles, have also their own distinct identity coming from their different historical situation they had been made within. The American political project worked as a melting pot, where immigrants that had left their European absolutist empires have adopted only one language, English, one new religious doctrine, Neo-Protestantism, one economic doctrine, the capitalist market economy, and one political system, the representative democracy, all these reunited under the pride of a unique model available for the entire world, the American model. Its force and the attraction generated towards the rest of the world consisted even in this unity and solidarity. On the other hand, the political project of the European Union had been outlined as a new change at the end of the great historical tragedy that bled the world, World War II. It has been developed after the fall of communism and the end of another huge historical trauma, the Cold War, as a fortunate opportunity for the countries and people in Central, North, and Southeastern Europe. The European Union is a political project with its own individual identity, a project that began from the conflict generating diversity during the time of national states. Not only that is accepted, but it also promoted the development of national, linguistic, religious, and cultural identities. The success of any project is connected to the presence of its resources. Conceived as a unity in diversity, the European Union project was and is an expensive project. It could not have been achieved without the help of the United States. This help has initially consisted of a substantial economic support through the Marshall Plan and through a military one within the NATO. The enlargement of the European Union, which integrated within it the countries in the Central, North, and Southeastern Europe, was also preceded by the integration of these countries in the NATO. Thus, the United States took over the protection of the European states' security and also absolved the European states for paying huge expenses for arming. Another canal through which the United States supported the enlargement of the European Union was the International Monetary Fund. The IMF not only that absolved the European Union for paying the very high cost of the economic consultancy for the post-communist transition, but also took over the reason that people felt for the social cost of the economic reforms to the people in Southeastern Europe that seems as imposed by the IMF and not by the European Union. Nowadays, the European Union, despite its deficit of administrative bureaucracy, works as an harmonious body where diversity looks like an advantage and not ballast. From my experience as a geologist, I have learned while researching big natural petrographic areas that a system subjected to strong oriented pressures, stress, holds better if it is flexible than rigid. In the present crisis, such a harmonious system can be carried out through an extended partnership EU-USA. Europe can offer possibilities for transferring the pressures, like the case of the dollar-euro binomials, or the opportunities of alternative approaches during some global or regional political crisis. Such structures would solve the problem for a short term, but on the long run, they will not prove efficient if Europe and America do not find the intellectual resources to make a new cultural model for the world to come. Making up the strategies, starting from the present policies and farther on, the vision of the future based on these long-term strategies, no matter how sustainable they were, means nothing but moving along towards the future with the backside. On the contrary, if we start from an inspired vision upon the future to the present, we can advance with our front part to the future, noticing at the same time both the obstacles and the dangers. The present financial crisis distracts our attention from an obvious fact. We pass from a one-pole world that replaced, by the end of the Cold War, the bipole wars of the East-West opposition, to a multi-pole world. This multi-pole world opens several ways that may seem attractive to the underdeveloped countries with totalitarian regimes. No model can anymore pretend to be a unique solution. As a European intellectual, I am far from thinking that the European Union would be such a unique model, but I can only consider it as a source of inspiration. A critical review of the European project is all the time necessary. For instance, we proudly talk about a common European identity based on shared values. Which are their values defining the European identity? How could be traversed without forgetting them, the specific characteristics and even the national limits on the way towards a common identity? The answer to these questions lies right inside the European project, but also in the European anxieties. If we will continue to shape projects without taking into account the inevitable anxieties involved by a political structure of 500 million inhabitants, then we have few chances left to develop a strong and democratic Europe. That is why I believe that the long way towards a European solidarity should start within every nation, local community, or even family. Here, where we can often notice a lot of the typical contradiction to the North and South or East and West world discrepancies. But this could also be the place where we can find the identity bender of a common ethos. Thus, we can better understand the world we live in. I believe that the Weltanschauung expression through which the German philosophers understood that every age has its own way to see and understand the world is valid today too, especially if we see it as a Gestalt der Weltanschauung, where the whole is more than the sum of the parts that compose it. This concept fits best to what politics should be in the knowledge society and in the globalized world of the future, a complex vision upon future based on a new dialogue about human values.
Thank you very much, President Constantinescu. I forgot to mention that as part of his multiple identity, he is also a professor of geology. So we are not only experts in the field here in political affairs, but also people from different academic backgrounds. Jack McDonald. The concept of unity in diversity as a motto of the European Union has been mentioned several times during our symposium, which is particularly interesting from a regional perspective, because it's one thing to be Germany or France with 60-something million or 80-something million and having a clear picture of what a national identity is about, and this fear of if you're small and if you're not even the status of a sovereign state, how does that affect cultural identity and also the perception of this ever-growing something, the European Union, in which a region plays a particular role and changes also the relationship with a nation state, in which it could either strengthen or weaken the regional identity in more federal structures, although I know that Britain wouldn't consider itself to be a federal system. But this idea of sharing power between the nation-state level and the regional level, which is something we find quite common in Germany with the various regional identities and also share of competences. So do we need something like a European identity? That's the question for someone who comes from an island. And at the same time, what kind of Europe should that be if we work on something like a common European identity?
Well, probably my first piece of advice would be to be very cautious in describing Scotland or Catalonia or Bavaria as regions rather than nations. I think some of us in Europe live within multinational states. We don't just live in a multinational or a multilateral Europe. But we also live inside multinational states, and I think that is true in Spain. I think it's true in Germany. The Bavarian state, with its own royal family and its own parliament, existed long after the independent Scottish state. Modern Germany is a different construct to even 19th century Germany. And I think it is important, I think, that in the debates about the future of the European Union, that is in some way reflected. It's not possible to build a European Union, I don't think, apart from on the pillars of the individual nation states that have national governments. But I think the European Union will be stronger if it recognises regional diversity, and within that, the fact that many of those regions were some of the great historic nations of Europe in centuries gone by. I think identity is in culture is a very complex thing, and I think we should all hesitate before trying to simplify it and even in many cases unify it. As I said yesterday, I feel Scottish, I feel European, I feel British, and I hope I act a bit like a global citizen. My good friend Ken Livingstone, who was the Mayor of London, used to say that he was a Londoner, he was English, and he was European before he was British. And that was somebody who came from London. So he had 4 identities. I think Marcia Barrett last night, I thought was fascinating, because she, despite having lived most of her life, almost all of her life, in the UK, in Germany, and in the US, clearly still feels Jamaican. That was obvious to all of us last night, I think, that her primary identity is Jamaican, despite being such an international emblem and someone who has lived in so many different countries and so little of her life in Jamaica. I think that to me, identity and culture are self-defining. They're not defined by your passport or your citizenship. They're defined by who you feel you are and what community you feel part of. And that can be more than one community. And I think if the European Union is to continue to succeed. It's been one of the most successful multilateral initiatives ever in the history of our world. It has brought peace and security to initially parts of a continent, now almost all of a continent, that had not experienced this length of period of peace and security ever before in history. And that is a phenomenal achievement and a recognition of the original vision. And it does need, I think I agree entirely with Emil, that it needs to be flexible in its edges in order to continue to succeed. But it also needs to recognize tensions created by that flexibility too. So while it is important that the European Union does not try to, and the European states don't try and create a European superstate or a common European identity that excludes all other aspects of one's identity and culture, at the same time, I think the recognition of tensions created by that flexibility are going to be important. I think my own personal view is that enlargement was vitally important. It was important for the former, either former Soviet states or those Eastern European countries that came inside the Eastern umbrella to have somewhere to go, somewhere to aim for, another set of countries and norms to work towards. And it was important that they were welcomed into the wider European family. But the fact that that has been done without the full implementation in some cases of all of the rules of the mainstream European Union countries has created tensions in the older members of the European Union. And I think we need to recognise that those tensions exist and be honest and transparent about that while working them through in a spirit of cooperation and mutual interest. I also have some things I might want to say later on about the way Europe is viewed, the way European identity is viewed elsewhere in the world, but I'll save those comments for later. So my view on this would be recognise that culture is an identity, very complex issue. Give absolute priority to self-definition, and recognise if the European Union is to continue to be successful, that both flexibility is required and continued enlargement, but also that within that flexibility, tensions can be created amongst the original members and some of the older members that need to be addressed and not just ignored by political leaders, because it was the ignoring of tensions in the past that led to the break-up of similar initiatives in our history.
Thank you, Jack. As an open violation of a cultural norm in the cultural space in which we live in, I ignored the rule ladies first. And as a violation of the diplomatic protocol, I ignored the rule of presidents first, because I thought, given the perspective and the dimension of your contribution in the speech, it would be perfect to have you to add something to the first round of speakers here by connecting your global vision of culture is human and it doesn't focus on a particular regional part of the world, like this European perspective here, with a self-definition of the European Union as a culture of diversity, which is now currently tested by the question of how diverse can we actually be to still function, which is a challenge to the institutional architecture of the European Union. And it also relates to the question of, is there something like a European way, maybe of life, or however you want to complete this, which goes without saying in the United States, that every culture of the world can mingle and participate in whatever metaphor we prefer, the melting pot, or what Mark often uses, the salad bowl in which a tomato is still a tomato. And where are the limits of such a project? Because it's one thing to declare, yes, we are all citizens and we can join something like this, in which it doesn't even matter where we come from, because we all feel connected more and more every day with more cultural experiences during the day and in the evening. And then we feel that we have so much in common together as the project of cultural diplomacy. But it's different if you run something like a political project like the European Union. So where are the limits for diversity, and what does that mean for European identity?
Thank you. I think that we have seen the groundwork of the various, the framework, if you like, both historically and politically of the situation in Europe. I think I'd start with the last part of your question as to what can happen in a Europe that is so diversified that would make it recognizably unified European. And at the political level, it's exceedingly simple. It is being engaged in a project, in a common project, that has sufficient numbers of individuals or citizens on board that they're ready to subscribe to it and work towards its accomplishment. That was the original aim of Jean Monnet and of Robert Schuman, that they wished to get on board people for a project. And it's interesting that in France to this day, people will talk about the European project, about the construction de l'Europe, with the idea that this is a work in progress. It's a building still being built. And each day, historically and in a time frame, and each day in every part of it, call it region, nation, country, nation state, a little brick is being added to the common project. And if there's a commitment from a sufficient critical mass of people that yes, we do have a common project, and yes, I'm a part of it and I'm willing to participate, then the thing is going to fly. No matter what experts say, like, you know, aeronautics experts used to say that bumblebees simply cannot fly because the parameters are all wrong in the way they're built. But the fact is, anything can fly if you actually put the right ingredients in it and you have the right commitment. That's at the political level. One must have a project that everybody sees the benefits of. And one of them being security, the lack of wars. We now think it's so trivial to have security. In my childhood, believe me, with bombs falling on your head and bullets whistling all around, you didn't think it was trivial. And after the collapse of the former Yugoslavia, believe me, it was not a trivial thing. People are being killed and maimed every day and massacred. The European continent has seen a lot of conflict until very recently indeed. Peace is one of the common elements that is worth keeping and working for. Prosperity is another, currently being put in danger and undermined. Well, this is a project that we have to work for. Let's see that we can do it. And if we can all see that there's a common benefit to be derived, then that will by itself build commitment and build a sense of belonging. I have often been speaking in both to the Committee of Regions and to being in different regions like Catalonia or in Ireland or wherever, and I hear from people this complaint. We feel that there's something going on there, there's a project. People in Brussels taking decisions or in our capital taking decisions, and I am not part of that project, I am not needed. I think the biggest challenge in a huge population like the European Union is to somehow convey to the citizens that there is room enough for everybody to get involved and that every single citizen has something to contribute, even if they don't become president of their country or CEO of the largest company in their country, and so on, that everybody is needed and everybody can contribute. If you have that sense of belonging and of being and contributing, then you will have identity. But it was interesting when you asked that first question about who feels an European. I saw an awful lot of hands. The question, and a few who said no, they do not. Among those who raised their hand and said they belong, my question would be, how many of you, if put together, locked together in the same room, would feel empathy with the people who are you with? Because of that same feeling of, yes, I feel a European. What does saying, I feel European, what does it give you? What does it allow you to, as an advantage in communicating with others? As a psychologist by training, I would say that this is a very crucial aspect of identity. If I feel and identify myself as something, I automatically give the benefit of the doubt to anybody else whom I encounter, who has the same identification, who says, I am a European, I am a woman, I am a handicapped person. I am a Democrat or a Republican or a Labourist or whatever. Somebody involved in a union movement and so on and so forth. That immediately you know that you have something in common with these people. But what does it mean? It means, again, that you can get involved in common projects. And we're back to the common project. In other words, that you have things that you hold dear, that you have goals that you wish to achieve, and that you feel that with these people on board and along with them, yes, you can achieve them. The identification with others is not a single one, and we heard this from the panelists. We all have multiple identifications. From the tiniest child who is being told that you're a little boy and you're a little girl, and little boys can do this and little girls can do that, we get put into these identification slots which open certain doors for us and close others. When you are from a rich family and born with a silver spoon in your mouth, you have endless possibilities, whereas in certain areas of this very continent, if your parents are a third generation of unemployed people because the coal mines closed decades ago, then of course your opportunities, your path in the world is going to be much more difficult. The regional identification, I think, is a very interesting question in Europe, because to me, it is part of the multi-level and multi-layered identity of Europe. We heard a very interesting sort of reminder of how Europe was built up. The nation state is a relatively modern construction. And it is true enough that Bismarck's Germany came very late in the game, and so did Garibaldi's Italy. Now I understand that the Piemontese are in fact deciding that Garibaldi was a bad guy, and they want to forget about all that Garibaldi achieved, and they wish to separate from the south of Italy, because they think it's the north of Italy that gets things done, and the others are simply sort of making difficulties for them. It's a constant process of evolution as to where you see common interests with those closest to you. And it may be on a basis of language, it may be on basis of religion, it may be on a basis of living in a certain region, in the mountains or in the plains. When you travel across large countries like France, you can notice how the architecture changes from region to region. They use the local stone, they use the local materials for building their homes. The cattle are of different colors. The pigs are different and the chickens are different. Everything is different, and the cheeses are different in France, because they have evolved over a long period of identification. But the French Revolution, more than the inheritance of the French kings, I think, made for the sense of belonging to France, the grandeur of France. The common educational system made them thus. The Reformation in the north of Europe made for, under the guise of wishing to instruct people to be able to read the Bible and to become good Christians, education, for instance, was introduced in my country to the peasants very early, right after the Reformation. And the country became literate. And that, of course, leaves a cultural layer that prepares them for eventually, at the first chance they get, and it may be a long time to wait for it, that ask for national independence, and so forth. But the most important thing is that we are not homogeneous single entities that are one thing on another. This is at wartime. When France was at war with Germany, then one had this simplification. Les Boches d'un côté and the Patriots on the other. On the other side, it was a different thing. You simplify the identity, you reduce it, say, to national belonging, or in the cases of the class war and the communist system, you distinguish the bourgeois against the working people, and so on. All these are artificial impositions on the rich diversity of human identification, which is as multi-layered as any onion ever was, and which can absorb an astounding, actually, variety of identifications. In my own life, I was born in Latvia. My parents left as exiles. I lived in Germany as an exile. I became partly identified with the Germans, who outside, we were inside the camp with British armed guards at the gate. But they still managed to play with German children and to identify with Germans and to feel some affinity with this country. I then lived in Morocco, in North Africa. And when I went back there as president of my native country on a state visit, the king said, "You spent your teenage years here. You are one of us, any time." And my former neighbors and the people who lived on the street where I used to live all came out en masse, and they said, "We are so pleased to see you. We feel you are one of us." And of course, I couldn't, though I was there on an official state visit from a different country, I had at the same time to realize that I felt one of them because I had lived in that country and I had come to love it and to enjoy it. And similarly, the long years that I spent on yet another continent in Canada. This has not prevented me, I think as was alluded to before, this has not prevented me from feeling as a patriotic Latvian, because after all, that is my birthright. And you see, I have found that wherever I went and people said, "Oh, Vaira Vīkis, that's a funny name, where do you come from?" In my native country, nobody asks me that. So I feel accepted, and that helps.
Thank you very much for that